I've come to claim my bank." The words hung in the air of Meridian Bank's marble lobby, spoken by an elderly man clutching a worn burlap sack. As laughter rippled through the space, no one realized they were witnessing the first moment of a revelation that would unravel 76 years of deception. For Marcus Caldwell, this declaration was the culmination of decades of waiting, planning, and holding on to a truth that had been deliberately buried by one of the most powerful families in Willow Creek. This is the story of how an elderly man, dismissed as delusional and nearly escorted out by security, proved to an entire community that he was the rightful founder of their most prestigious financial institution, and how his evidence shook the very foundations of a dynasty built on lies. Before we continue, if you've ever felt overlooked or had your contributions erased, this story might resonate with you in ways you never expected. Take a moment to subscribe and hit that like button. It helps others find these hidden stories of justice that too often remain buried beneath the glossy surface of official histories. Have you ever wondered what secrets lie in your town's past? What truths have been conveniently forgotten? In the quiet town of Willow Creek, where oak-lined streets led to colonial-style buildings, and everyone knew everyone else's business, Meridian Bank stood as a monument to prosperity. Its marble columns and crystal chandeliers spoke of wealth and permanence, a financial fortress that had served the community for generations. The name Harrington was emblazoned across its entrance, honoring the family that had supposedly founded the institution in the early 1950s. But on a crisp autumn morning in 2019, as golden leaves danced along the sidewalk outside the bank's polished windows, history itself was about to be rewritten. Marcus Caldwell was 89 years old when he decided it was time. His weathered hands clutched a burlap sack as he shuffled through Meridian Bank's heavy glass doors. The security guard barely glanced his way. To anyone watching, he was just another elderly customer, perhaps coming to make a modest deposit from his pension check or to ask for help balancing his checkbook. Marcus's clothes were clean but worn. A button-up shirt that had seen better decades, pressed pants that hung loosely on his thinning frame, and shoes polished to a shine that couldn't hide their age. His eyes, however, told a different story. They held the clear, unflinching gaze of a man who had carried a purpose through decades of waiting. The bank lobby hummed with the quiet efficiency of modern banking. Young professionals in crisp suits tapped away at keyboards behind gleaming counters. Customers waited in organized lines, scrolling through phones and avoiding eye contact. The marble floor reflected the warm glow of recessed lighting from the high ceiling. Marcus stood in the center of the lobby, his presence barely causing a ripple in the choreographed routines around him. He cleared his throat, the sound lost among the gentle clicks of computer keys and murmured transactions. "I've come to claim my bank," he said, his voice stronger than his appearance would suggest. The first person to notice was a young teller named Elise Chen, who paused mid-sentence while helping a customer. She glanced at Marcus with polite confusion, then resumed her transaction. But Marcus spoke again, louder this time. "This building, this bank, Meridian Bank, belongs to me." That the ambient noise dimmed as customers and employees turned toward the unexpected disturbance. Robert Walsh, the security guard stationed near the entrance, shifted his weight and took a step forward, his expression a practiced mix of authority and patience. "Sir," he said, approaching Marcus with the careful manner reserved for those who might be confused or disoriented. "Can I help you find someone? Perhaps you'd like to sit down?" By now, several customers had turned to watch. A woman in a business suit whispered to her companion. A young man with headphones removed one earbud. The branch manager, Victoria Henderson, emerged from her office, alerted by the unusual disruption in her carefully maintained environment. "I'm not confused," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "I built this bank. I founded it in 1947 before it was stolen from me." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through the lobby. Victoria Henderson approached with a professional smile, her heels clicking authoritatively on the marble floor. "Good morning, sir. I'm Victoria Henderson, branch manager. Perhaps we could speak in my office? We can check your accounts and sort out any confusion." Marcus didn't move. Instead, he looked around at the faces watching him, Some amused, some embarrassed, some simply impatient for the interruption to end so they could return to their business. "There's no confusion to sort out, Miss Henderson. My name is Marcus Caldwell, and I founded Meridian Bank 76 years ago with my business partner, Richard Harrington." The name Harrington caused Victoria's smile to falter momentarily. It was the name everyone in Willow Creek associated with the bank, the family whose portraits hung in the boardroom, whose philanthropy had shaped the town for generations. "Sir, the Harrington family founded this bank in 1952. Perhaps you're thinking of another institution?" Marcus slowly shook his head. "No, Miss Henderson. Meridian was founded in 1947, not 1952. The dates were changed, just like the ownership records." By now, several employees had stopped working to watch the exchange. Robert moved closer, prepared to escort the elderly man outside if necessary. Victoria's smile had become strained. "Sir, I think." But Marcus had already bent down, his movements deliberate as he untied the string around his burlap sack. The lobby fell silent as he reached inside and began to remove its contents. First came a leather-bound ledger, its cover cracked with age but the gold embossing still visible. "Meridian Bank, 1947. Next, bundles of old banknotes, still strapped with paper bands bearing an unfamiliar logo, the original Meridian Bank emblem, not the modernized version that now adorned the building. Then documents, yellowed but preserved in plastic sleeves, bearing signatures and official seals from a time when most people in the room hadn't yet been born. Victoria's professional demeanor slipped as she stared at the items now arranged on the marble floor. Several customers had edged closer, curiosity overcoming their initial dismissal. Robert stood frozen, uncertain how to proceed. "These are the original founding documents," Marcus said, his voice quiet but carrying in the hushed lobby. "Signed by myself and Richard Harrington, equal partners." Victoria knelt to examine the ledger, her brow furrowed. She carefully turned the brittle pages, revealing handwritten entries, balance sheets, and loan records dating back to 1947, 5 years earlier than the bank's official founding date. "This can't be real," she murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. Marcus reached into the sack again and withdrew a small framed photograph. It showed 2 young men standing proudly in front of a modest storefront with a hand-painted sign reading Meridian Bank. One was unmistakably a younger version of Marcus himself. The other, with his arm thrown casually around Marcus's shoulders, bore the distinctive Harrington features that anyone in Willow Creek would recognize from the portraits displayed throughout town. "Richard and I were like brothers," Marcus said, his voice softening with memory. "We pooled everything we had after returning from the war. Built this bank from nothing. We wanted to help returning veterans buy homes, start businesses, people the big banks wouldn't take a chance on." Victoria had gone pale as she examined the photograph, then looked back at the ledger. A senior teller had joined her, his expression growing increasingly troubled as he compared the signatures in the ledger to the framed Harrington signature that hung behind the teller counter. "What happened?" Victoria asked, almost involuntarily. Marcus's eyes grew distant. "Success happened. Money happened. By 1951, Meridian was the most successful bank in 3 counties. Richard started bringing his brother Edward into decisions. I didn't mind at first. Family is family. But Edward had different ideas about who we should serve, how we should grow." The lobby was completely silent now. Even customers who had initially seemed impatient were listening, drawn into the unfolding story despite themselves. I wanted to keep focusing on the community, regular folks who needed a chance. Edward wanted bigger clients, fancier offices. Richard was caught in the middle. Marcus gestured around at the marble and brass that surrounded them. "You can see who won that argument. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover they've been working against you all along? Have you felt that moment when suspicion crystallizes into certainty, when betrayal becomes undeniable?" That's the moment Marcus described next. "In January 1952, I came to the bank and found the locks changed. When I finally got hold of Richard, he wouldn't meet my eyes, said there had been an emergency board meeting, said I'd been voted out due to irreconcilable differences in business philosophy. There was no board, just Richard, Edward, and their lawyer." Marcus paused, his weathered hands resting on the ledger. They offered me a settlement, a fraction of what my half was worth. When I refused and threatened to fight it in court, Edward told me exactly what would happen. In 1952, Richard Harrington had connections I couldn't match. Judges, newspaper editors, town officials, they all owed him favors or wanted to be in his good graces. Victoria had risen to her feet, her professional mask completely fallen away. But surely there were records, other witnesses. Records can be changed, Marcus replied simply. The founding date became 1952. My name disappeared. The few employees we had were either paid for their silence or told I'd had a breakdown. After a while, it was easier for people to believe the story they were told than to question the most powerful family in Willow Creek. A heavy-set man in an expensive suit pushed through the growing crowd. "What's going on here, Victoria?" he demanded, his voice carrying the easy authority of someone accustomed to immediate deference. "Mr. Harrington," Victoria stammered, "this gentleman is—" "Marcus Caldwell," the man finished, his face draining of color as he stared at the elderly man. My God. James Harrington, current president of Meridian Bank and great-nephew of Richard Harrington, looked as though he'd seen a ghost, and in many ways he had. Marcus Caldwell was supposed to be a family secret, a footnote buried so deep in history that he might as well have never existed. "You know who I am," Marcus observed quietly. James Harrington straightened his tie, visibly composing himself. "I've heard stories, family rumors, nothing substantial." "Then how did you know my name?" Marcus asked. The question hung in the air between them, unanswered. In the silence, Marcus reached once more into his sack and withdrew a final document. Newer than the others, its official seal and modern typography standing in stark contrast to the aged contents already displayed. "This is a DNA analysis," Marcus said, holding it out for anyone to see, comparing my DNA with samples from Richard Harrington's exhumed remains. The test was court-ordered after I discovered this. He placed a yellowed envelope beside the DNA results. Richard's confession, written on his deathbed in 1986. His daughter found it among his personal papers last year and sought me out. She's the one who helped me get the exhumation order. James Harrington's face had gone from pale to ashen. "That's impossible. My great-uncle would never." "He did," came a new voice from the entrance. A woman in her 60s stood in the doorway, her resemblance to James unmistakable, despite her simple dress and lack of jewelry. "My father couldn't die in peace with what he'd done, Uncle James. You know that. The nightmares, the drinking, it all stemmed from his guilt." Martha Harrington Wells stepped into the lobby, nodding respectfully to Marcus, before turning to address the stunned onlookers. "My father, Richard Harrington, betrayed his best friend and business partner. Our family wealth, everything we've built, every building with our name, it all began with that betrayal. I found my father's confession last year while clearing out his lake house. It took me months to track down Mr. Caldwell." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Customers exchanged shocked glances. Employees stood frozen behind their counters. Victoria Henderson looked as though the floor had dropped from beneath her feet. James Harrington found his voice at last. "Martha, you had no right to pursue this without consulting the family. These are serious allegations that could damage—" "They're not allegations, James," Martha interrupted firmly. "They're facts. Documented, proven facts. I've spent the last year working with Mr. Caldwell's attorney to verify everything. The DNA test confirms that the confession is genuine. My father's own words, his own handwriting." She turned to address the onlookers directly. "My father wrote that he never forgave himself for what he did to Marcus. His brother Edward was the architect of the betrayal, but my father was too weak to stand against him. By the time he found his courage, it was too late. Marcus had disappeared, presumed dead by most who remembered him." At this point in our story, I want you to consider, how many institutions around us were built on forgotten injustices? How many fortunes began with someone's rightful share being taken? How many families have elevated themselves by standing on the shoulders of partners they pushed into obscurity? Marcus Caldwell had not come to the bank that day seeking vengeance. At 89, after a lifetime of struggling to rebuild after his world collapsed, he wanted something more precious than money. Acknowledgement, recognition of the truth, his name restored to the history he helped create. "I don't want to destroy what's been built here," Marcus said, looking around at the employees whose livelihoods depended on Meridian Bank. "The bank serves the community. That's what matters, what always mattered to me." Martha stepped forward, standing beside Marcus with quiet determination. "My father's confession included his wish that should Marcus ever be found, the wrong should be made right. A trust was established, separate from the family and bank assets, that has grown significantly over the decades. It was his attempt at atonement, though he never believed Marcus would be found alive." James Harrington's expression hardened. "Martha, these are family matters that should be discussed privately, not in front of witnesses?" Marcus interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. "That's how I lost everything the first time, James. Everything done in secret, behind closed doors, with no one to see the truth." The tension between them was palpable. Two men, one at the end of his life, one in his prime, representing different sides of a decades-old injustice. Around them, the modern bank with its computers and security cameras and regulatory compliance bore little resemblance to the modest storefront where two young veterans had once dreamed of helping their community prosper. Victoria Henderson cleared her throat, her professional training reasserting itself in the crisis. "Perhaps we should move this discussion to the conference room? I can have coffee brought in and—" "No," Marcus said firmly. "I spent 76 years in the shadows. Whatever happens next, happens in the light." Have you ever wondered what it would take for a powerful institution to acknowledge a fundamental wrongdoing at the core of its existence? What would make them rewrite their own origin story? In most cases, it might take legal battles spanning years, armies of lawyers, and resources beyond the reach of an ordinary person. But sometimes, truth has its own power when exposed at precisely the right moment. What no one in the bank lobby knew that morning was that a financial reporter from the Willow Creek Gazette had been at a nearby table, originally there to interview Victoria Henderson about the bank's upcoming centennial plans. Instead, Jessica Tran had captured every word of Marcus's story on her phone, along with images of the documents and the confrontation with James Harrington. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, stepping forward, "I'm Jessica Tran from the Gazette. Would you be willing to go on record with your story?" James Harrington's face flushed. "This is preposterous. Our legal team will—" "Will what, James?" Martha interrupted. "Sue to suppress the DNA evidence, file motions to seal my father's confession, fight to keep Marcus Caldwell's name buried for another generation?" She turned to the reporter. "I'll go on record too. The Harrington family has lived with this secret for too long." The story of Marcus Caldwell and Meridian Bank broke that afternoon on the Gazette's website. By evening, it had been picked up by regional news outlets. By the following morning, national financial news programs were featuring segments on the forgotten founder and the ethical implications for modern banking institutions built on questionable foundations. The Harrington family, through their corporate public relations team, issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging historical discrepancies in the bank's founding narrative and promising a full investigation. Behind closed doors, however, the family was in turmoil. Cousins who had never questioned their legacy found themselves divided between those who wanted to fight the revelations and those who, like Martha, believed the time for truth had come. 3 days after Marcus Caldwell walked into the bank with his burlap sack of evidence, the board of directors called an emergency meeting. James Harrington argued vehemently against any admission of wrongdoing, warning of shareholder lawsuits and regulatory scrutiny. But as the media storm intensified and depositors began asking uncomfortable questions, the board's position weakened. It was Martha Harrington Wells who proposed the solution that would ultimately prevail. She suggested the bank commission an independent historical investigation with full access to all archives and records. The results would be made public, no matter what they revealed. And most significantly, she proposed that Marcus Caldwell be immediately named Chairman Emeritus of Meridian Bank, with full financial compensation for his lost decades of ownership. "Our family will weather this," she told the resistant board members. "But only if we face it honestly. The Harrington name can represent redemption rather than continued deception." 1 week after his appearance at the bank, Marcus Caldwell sat in the boardroom where portraits of the Harrington family had hung for generations. Beside him was a newly installed photograph, the same one he had carried in his burlap sack, showing him and Richard Harrington standing proudly before their fledgling bank in 1947. In a ceremony broadcast on local television, James Harrington reluctantly but publicly acknowledged the true founding date of Meridian Bank and Marcus's role as co-founder. The official history was amended. The trust established by Richard Harrington was transferred to Marcus, along with a seat on the board for both him and his descendants. For Marcus, the acknowledgement meant more than the money. As he told Jessica Tran in an exclusive interview, "For most of my life, I thought justice was impossible against power like theirs. I nearly gave up many times. What kept me going was knowing that somewhere, buried in records and memories, the truth still existed. Truth doesn't expire." The story of Meridian Bank sent ripples through the financial industry. Other institutions with long histories began internal reviews of their own founding narratives. Historians and journalists started investigating similar cases of erased founders and partners, particularly those involving women and minorities whose contributions had been systematically minimized or eliminated. Marcus Caldwell lived just long enough to see his granddaughter Alina take her seat on Meridian's board of directors. He passed away peacefully in his sleep exactly 1 year after the day he walked into the bank with his burlap sack. At his funeral, attended by hundreds of community members who had followed his story, Martha Harrington Wells delivered a eulogy that acknowledged both the injustice he had suffered and the healing his courage had made possible. Today, visitors to Meridian Bank are greeted by a bronze plaque in the lobby that reads, "Founded 1947 by Marcus Caldwell and Richard Harrington." Beside it hangs a smaller plaque with a quote from Marcus himself. "Truth may be delayed, but it cannot be permanently denied." The story of Marcus Caldwell reminds us that beneath the polished narratives of success often lie forgotten contributors whose names have been erased from history. It challenges us to question official histories, especially those that serve the powerful. And it offers hope that even after decades of invisibility, justice can still be found if we have the courage to demand it. Have you ever wondered about the true origins of the institutions in your own community, the businesses, buildings, and organizations that shape your daily life? Perhaps there are other Marcus Caldwells out there, waiting for their truths to be acknowledged. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the histories we take for granted, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps bring these hidden stories to light. Stories that might otherwise remain buried beneath comfortable myths and convenient falsehoods. Because ultimately, this isn't just Marcus Caldwell's story. It's a story about all of us, about the societies we build, the truths we choose to face or ignore, and the possibility that it's never too late for justice to prevail. Thank you for watching.